Picture a German infantryman in October 1942, pressed flat against a shattered brick wall inside a building that used to be part of a tractor factory. 9 weeks ago, his unit crossed 1,000 miles of open steppe in days, riding tanks that nothing in the Red Army could stop, escorted by dive bombers that turned resistance into rubble before a single German boot hit the ground. He is never lost. His army has never lost. Its doctrine, deep armored thrusts, overwhelming air support, speed shattering an enemy before it can react, has flattened Poland, France, the Balkans, and half of European Russia in 3 years. Now he is crawling 20 meters at a time through a hole punched in a wall, because the street outside is a killing field. He can hear Russian voices 1 floor above him, close enough to smell their cigarette smoke. His own artillery hasn't fired within 400 meters of this position in a week because his officers can no longer say with confidence where the front line actually is. It moves by the hour. Sometimes it moves by the room. His commanders keep promising the city will fall in a matter of days. That promise is now 2 months old. Nobody told him, because at the time nobody in Berlin fully understood it, that he had walked into the middle of a trap built from 2 ideas so unglamorous that military textbooks had mostly ignored them. Get so close to the enemy that his advantages stop mattering, and lie to him so completely about what is coming that by the time he sees it, it is already too late. That is the hidden strategy of Stalingrad. It did not come from a secret weapon, a lost battalion, or a code word whispered in some forgotten bunker. It came from 2 Soviet commanders, one fighting in the wreckage of a city, the other planning 400 kilometers away, who understood something the most powerful army on earth refused to believe. You do not have to be stronger than your enemy. You only have to make his strength stop mattering. This is the story of how they did it. The road to Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, the German war machine had every reason to believe it was unstoppable. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched a year earlier as Operation Barbarossa, had failed to knock Moscow out of the war the way Hitler had wanted, but the Wehrmacht had still swallowed enormous stretches of Soviet territory, encircled entire armies, and inflicted catastrophic losses on the Red Army. Now Hitler wanted a new target, and this time the goal wasn't only territory, it was oil. The German war economy was starving for fuel, and the Caucasus region far to the south held the fields that could solve the problem: Maikop, Grozny, and eventually Baku on the Caspian Sea. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched Case Blue, an offensive aimed at seizing those oil fields while protecting its long-exposed eastern flank by capturing a city on the Volga River that happened to carry Stalin's own name, Stalingrad. Strategically, the city mattered because it sat on a critical bend of the Volga, a river that carried oil, grain, and war material north from the Caucasus into the Soviet industrial heartland. Cutting that artery and anchoring the German flank there made hard military sense. But something else was at work too, something less rational and far more personal. A city named for the Soviet leader captured by German arms was propaganda too valuable for Hitler to leave alone. What began as a supporting operation to protect a flank slowly hardened into an obsession in its own right, one that would eventually consume an entire army. Army Group B received the assignment, and within it the German 6th Army, one of the most experienced battle-hardened formations in the whole Wehrmacht, was handed the job of taking the city itself, with the 4th Panzer Army providing armored support from the south. 6th Army's commander, General Friedrich Paulus, was a careful, meticulous staff officer rather than a swashbuckling tank commander, and few doubted that his methodical planning, paired with his veteran divisions, would crack the city quickly. Every major Soviet city in the path of the German advance so far, Kiev, Kharkov, Smolensk, Minsk, had eventually fallen, some only after ferocious resistance, but fallen nonetheless.
23 August 1942. The German 4th Air Fleet unleashed one of the most devastating bombing raids of the entire war on Stalingrad. Wave after wave of bombers hit the city through most of the day, targeting the oil storage tanks along the riverbank, the rail yards, and the densely packed wooden housing that made up much of the city's residential districts. Fire spread out of control. Oil tanks burst and burned for days, sending columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the sky, visible for miles across the steppe. Estimates of civilian dead from that single day run into the tens of thousands, among the worst single-day death tolls anywhere in the European war. At the time, it looked like exactly the kind of overwhelming force the Wehrmacht had used to break cities before. What nobody in the German high command grasped in the moment was that they had just done something that would come back to defeat them. They had turned an ordinary industrial city into a landscape of rubble, craters, and half-collapsed concrete. A landscape that erased almost every advantage a mechanized, air-supported army possessed, and replaced it with a battlefield built for a completely different kind of war. A war fought room by room, floor by floor, at a range measured in meters instead of kilometers. German troops reached the northern outskirts of the city within days of the bombing. Soviet resistance, at first, looked exactly like what German intelligence expected: disorganized, undersupplied, fought by a Red Army still reeling from a summer of retreats. Paulus's staff had every reason for confidence. Nothing in the campaign so far suggested this city would be any different from the others that had come before it. They were about to meet a different kind of opponent and a different kind of war. Chuikov takes command. By the second week of September 1942, the battle for the city itself had begun in earnest, and it was going badly for the Soviet side. German forces had punched into the southern and central districts. The Soviet 62nd Army, tasked with holding the city, was being ground down division by division. Its commanders rotated out as the situation collapsed. Stalin had already issued Order No. 227 that July, the order that became known by its blunt nickname, "Not One Step Back," which threatened retreating officers and men with tribunal, demotion into penal battalions, or execution. It was a brutal, coercive document, and it reflected how close to the edge Soviet high command believed the entire southern front had come. On 12 September 1942, a new commander took over the 62nd Army, Lieutenant General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov. He was not a glamorous choice. Chuikov had grown up in a peasant family, gone to work in a factory at the age of 12, and risen through the ranks of the Red Army the hard way, through the Civil War, staff postings in China, and a stint commanding an army during the brief, brutal Winter War against Finland. He was blunt, physically tough, and by most accounts not an easy man to work for. But he understood something crucial, and he understood it immediately. This battle could not be won by fighting the way the manual said to fight. Chuikov's own later writing about those first days makes clear how stark his assessment was. His army was outgunned, outnumbered in artillery and armor, and facing an enemy with total command of the sky. Standard Soviet doctrine, built around maneuver, reserves, and set-pace counterattacks, would simply feed men into a machine perfectly designed to destroy them at a distance. Every time the 62nd Army tried to mass for a conventional counterattack in open ground, German aircraft and artillery would locate and annihilate it before it could accomplish anything. So Chuikov made a decision that ran against everything Soviet and German pre-war doctrine assumed about how a modern army would fight. If the enemy's overwhelming advantage was long-range firepower and air support, then the answer was not to match that firepower. The answer was to make range itself disappear. If Soviet soldiers stayed close enough to German soldiers, 30 meters, 20 meters, sometimes across a single stairwell or a shared wall, no dive bomber pilot could hit the Soviet line without also killing his own comrades below. No artillery battery could drop a barrage on Soviet positions without also landing shells among German ones. It was in essence judo obliged.
To modern combined arms warfare, use the mass and momentum of a superior opponent against itself. Turn his own weapons into something he could no longer use without harming himself. This idea did not exist as a line in any pre-war Red Army field manual. It emerged out of necessity, forged inside a collapsing defensive perimeter by a commander who had run out of better options, and found, almost by accident, a devastating one. Over the following weeks, it would harden from an improvised survival tactic into a deliberate, systematic doctrine, one that would turn Stalingrad into one of the most peculiar battlefields of the entire Second World War, and one of the most instructive. To understand why it worked as well as it did, it helps to understand exactly what it looked like on the ground. Hidden Strategy 1: Hugging the Enemy. Historians and veterans of the battle came to call Chuikov's approach hugging the enemy. The term sounds almost gentle for something so violent, but it is precise. The goal was proximity, deliberate, constant, suffocating proximity, used as a weapon in its own right. In practice, this meant Soviet positions were pushed forward until the gap between the two sides shrank to a range where heavy weapons became useless, and only small arms, grenades, and knives still worked. In the ruined apartment blocks and factory buildings that made up central Stalingrad, this sometimes meant Soviet and German soldiers occupied different floors of the very same building, firing at each other through holes blown in the ceilings and floors, close enough to hear each other breathing, coughing, praying. German soldiers began calling this kind of fighting Rotten Creek, War of the Rats, and joked bitterly among themselves that they could capture the kitchen of a building and still be fighting for the bedroom 3 doors down. The tactical logic behind it was ruthless and simple. German combined arms doctrine, the same doctrine that had shattered French and Polish defenses in weeks, depended on a division of labor. Dive bombers and artillery softened up a position from a distance, then tanks and infantry moved in to finish the job with the enemy already broken. It was an approach built for open country, where a kilometer of separation between friend and foe was easy to maintain and easy to exploit. Inside the wreckage of Stalingrad, with front lines running through the middle of individual buildings, that kilometer of separation simply did not exist anymore. Stuka dive bomber pilots could not tell from the air which pile of rubble held Germans and which held Russians. Artillery observers on the ground faced the same problem. Call in a barrage on a position 50 meters away, and there was a very real chance of killing your own men. Chuikov leaned into this constraint instead of fighting it. He ordered his forces to close the distance wherever possible, to dig in as near to German positions as the terrain allowed, and to treat any gap in the line as something to be closed immediately rather than defended from range. Soviet accounts from the period describe a deliberate effort to make every German soldier feel that a Russian rifle was effectively aimed at him at all times, from a distance close enough that safety no longer existed anywhere in the city, not even inside four walls and a roof. There was a second effect, one that mattered just as much as neutralizing German air power. The bombed-out ruins of the city, the same wreckage created by that catastrophic raid on 23 August, turned out to be dreadful terrain for tanks. Panzers that could sprint across open steppe at speed became slow, vulnerable machines picking their way through collapsed buildings, rubble piles, and narrow, debris-choked streets. Chuikov's forces used this to their advantage, luring German armor into the ruins where its mobility counted for nothing, then destroying individual tanks at close range with Molotov cocktails, anti-tank rifles, and satchel charges thrown from windows and doorways above. A machine designed to win wars of movement was being defeated one tank at a time in a landscape where movement itself had become impossible. None of this made Stalingrad an easy fight for the Soviet side, quite the opposite. Casualties inside the 62nd Army were horrific, and Chuikov's own memoirs and later histories made clear that entire regiments were consumed and replaced within days during the worst periods of the fighting in September and October.
1942. Hugging the enemy was not a clever trick that made the battle safe. It was a brutal trade. Accept catastrophic close-range casualties in order to deny the Wehrmacht the one advantage that made all its other advantages possible, the ability to fight from a distance. It worked because it attacked the foundation of German operational doctrine, rather than its details. You cannot out-tank a force with better tanks, and you cannot outfly a force with better aircraft, but you can make tanks and aircraft irrelevant if you are willing to pay the price of getting close enough that using them becomes a threat to their own side. That was the trade Chuikov made, over and over, for nearly 6 months. To make hugging the enemy work at the scale a whole army needed, though, required more than an order from headquarters. It required an entirely new way of organizing the men doing the actual fighting. Hidden Strategy 2. The Storm Groups. Ordering soldiers to fight at close range was one thing. Organizing them so that close-range fighting actually won ground, instead of just producing casualties on both sides, was another problem entirely, and it is where Chuikov's doctrine turned into something genuinely new in the history of infantry combat. The Red Army had used small assault detachments before, but at Stalingrad the concept was refined into something closer to a system, the Sturmovaya Grupa, or Storm Group. A typical storm group was small by design, often 6 to 8 men, deliberately kept lean so it could move fast through terrain no vehicle could cross, collapsed stairwells, punched through walls, sewer tunnels, half-buried basements. But small did not mean lightly equipped. A storm group was usually built in layers, a forward assault element carrying grenades, submachine guns, and often a flamethrower or satchel charges to do the actual close-quarters killing, a support element right behind it with machine guns and anti-tank rifles to seal off the position once it was taken, and to cover the assault team's approach and withdrawal, and further back, a reserve prepared either to reinforce success or cover a retreat if the attack failed. Engineers trained in demolitions were frequently attached, and snipers were used to cover approaches and pick off anyone who exposed themselves in a doorway or window. This was, in effect, combined arms warfare shrunk down from the scale of armies to the scale of a single squad. Infantry, engineers, heavy weapons, and marksmen, cross-supporting each other, but operating over a battle space measured in meters rather than kilometers. One of the storm group's most distinctive habits was something soldiers at the time nicknamed mouse-holing. Rather than move between buildings by crossing streets and squares, open ground that German machine guns and snipers had turned into shooting galleries, storm groups blew or hacked holes directly through the interior walls connecting one building to the next. An entire assault could move through what had once been a city block without a single soldier stepping outside, appearing suddenly in the middle of a building the enemy believed was still secure 2 floors below or 2 rooms over. It denied the defender the warning that open movement would normally provide, and it meant that soldiers rarely needed to expose themselves to the sniper fire and machine gun crossfire that dominated the city's open spaces. Clearing a single building under this system could take days. Attackers moved level by level, sometimes fighting for a stairwell for hours, sometimes tunneling through a wall only to find the room beyond it just as heavily defended as the one they had already taken. Some of the war's most notorious close-quarters fighting took place in the industrial districts on the city's northern edge, the Red October Steelworks, the Barricady Arms Factory, and the Dzierżyński Tractor Factory, where German and Soviet troops fought for individual workshops and furnace rooms with a ferocity that shocked veterans who had already survived years of war on other fronts. What makes the Storm Group concept genuinely significant beyond its role in this one battle is how much it anticipated later military thinking.
Long after Stalingrad, urban warfare doctrine developed by militaries around the world converged on strikingly similar principles. Small, self-contained assault teams, combined firepower kept close at hand rather than called in from a distance, systematic building clearance rather than street-level advances, heavy reliance on engineers and demolitions to create movement routes the enemy cannot predict. None of this
written into a Soviet field manual before 1942. It was invented, improvised, and refined under fire in a single ruined city. One of the war's clearest examples of a battlefield problem generating a genuinely new tactical solution rather than a rehearsed textbook answer. But storm groups alone did not win individual streets, let alone the battle. Some of the most consequential fighting in all of Stalingrad happened not across whole factory complexes, but inside a single apartment building. One that became so notorious that, as the story is often told, German mapmakers reportedly marked it on their charts as if it were a fortress in its own right. Case study: Pavlov's house. If you want to understand exactly how much force a handful of soldiers could generate using Chuikov's doctrine, there is no better example than a single 4-story apartment block near the center of the city, overlooking a plaza called 9 January Square. In late September 1942, a roughly 30-man Soviet platoon was ordered to retake the building from German troops who had seized it days earlier. The assault was brutal. By the time the building was secured, only 4 men were left standing from the original platoon, among them a young acting platoon commander, Junior Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, put in charge only because every officer and senior sergeant above him had already been killed or wounded. Pavlov and his 3 surviving soldiers held the building alone for several days before reinforcements arrived. Those reinforcements, led by Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev, brought the garrison up to somewhere between 20 and 30 men, an understrength platoon by any conventional standard, expected to hold a position against repeated German infantry and tank assaults for what would ultimately stretch into roughly 2 months. What made the building worth that sacrifice was its position, not its size. From its upper floors, defenders had a clear line of sight nearly a kilometer in 3 directions, north, south, and west, over the surrounding rubble. It also sat close to the Volga riverbank, anchoring one edge of the thin strip of the city the 62nd Army still controlled, the strip its soldiers grimly called the bridgehead, with the river itself at their backs and nowhere left to retreat. Afanasyev's men fortified the building methodically. They laid mines on every approach, strung barbed wire around the perimeter, and positioned machine guns and anti-tank rifles at windows on multiple floors so that no single direction of attack could be pressed without walking into a crossfire. When German tanks attempted to cross the square toward the building, defenders used a heavy anti-tank rifle positioned on the roof, firing down into the thinner armor on a tank's upper surfaces at ranges close enough that a single accurate hit could disable it. Accounts from survivors credit the defenders with damaging or destroying close to a dozen tanks over the course of the siege using this single weapon and position. Civilians were still living in the building's basement throughout the fighting, a detail that captures better than almost anything else from the battle just how thoroughly the line between combat zone and home had dissolved inside Stalingrad by the autumn of 1942. The defenders held their position from late September until late November, close to 60 days, through repeated German assaults until Soviet counterattacking forces finally reached and relieved them. The building's platoon belonged to the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment, part of the 13th Guards Rifle Division, one of the units whose arrival, weeks earlier, had itself been a near-run thing. In mid-September 1942, with the 62nd Army's position on the point of collapse, the 13th Guards had been rushed across the Volga at night under German artillery and air attack, its soldiers wading and rowing across open water while shells fell around them, in order to reinforce a defensive line that Soviet commanders feared would not survive the week without them. The division paid dearly for that crossing and for the fighting that followed at Mamayev Kurgan, a shattered hill overlooking the city that changed hands more times than almost any other position in the battle. It would go on to fight at Kursk the following year and end the war deep inside Germany, but its name is remembered above all for the apartment block its soldiers turned into one of the most stubborn defensive positions of the entire war. Multiply that single building by dozens of similar strongpoints across the city.
Factory workshops, grain silos, department store basements, individual apartment blocks, and you start to see the actual shape of Chuikov's strategy. It was not one clever trick. It was a citywide network of small, brutally stubborn positions, each one forcing the German Sixth Army to spend days or weeks and enormous quantities of men and ammunition capturing a single building, block, or hillside, over and over, for months, while never quite closing the final few hundred meters to the river. Holding those positions took more than machine guns and mines, though. It also took men who could see through smoke and rubble at ranges other soldiers couldn't, and who could turn every hour a German soldier spent above ground into a hazard. Hidden Strategy 3. The Sniper War. Close-range fighting rewards a particular kind of soldier, one who is patient, who knows the terrain intimately, and who can turn a single well-placed shot into a psychological weapon that outlasts its own echo. Stalingrad produced a generation of Soviet snipers who became, alongside the storm groups, one of the most effective tools inside Chuikov's broader strategy. The most famous of them was Vasily Chuikov, a Red Army marksman whose confirmed kills during the battle made him a national celebrity while the fighting was still going on. Soviet commanders recognized early that sniper warfare offered something beyond its direct battlefield value. It was extraordinary propaganda. A single soldier with a rifle and a scope, credited publicly with dozens of confirmed kills, was a story that could be printed in Red Army newspapers and used to build morale across an entire front, at a moment when morale was in desperately short supply. Zaitsev himself was credited with training other soldiers in marksmanship and fieldcraft during the battle, multiplying his impact well beyond his own rifle. It's worth being honest about where the historical record gets thinner. Popular accounts of the battle, including a famous story about a personal duel between Zaitsev and a supposed master sniper sent from a German sniper school specifically to kill him, have been retold so often and dramatized so heavily in books and film that many historians now treat the more cinematic details of that particular story with real skepticism. Some question whether that duel took place in the form usually described, or at all. What is much better documented is the broader pattern. Stalingrad saw a systematic, deliberate expansion of Soviet sniper training and sniper propaganda, and marksmen operating at exactly the ranges Chuikov's doctrine created played a real significant role in the fighting. That role fit naturally into the larger hidden strategy. In a battlefield where the front line ran through the middle of buildings, a sniper covering a stairwell, a window, or a gap between rubble piles could deny German soldiers freedom of movement across an entire sector without firing more than a handful of shots a day. It reinforced exactly the psychological effect hugging the enemy was designed to produce, the sense among German troops that no space behind the immediate front was ever truly safe. A soldier stepping into what he believed was a rear area, out of the main line of fire, could still be killed by someone he never saw, from a position he could not identify. That uncertainty had a corrosive effect on morale that outlasted any individual engagement. Combined, the storm groups and the snipers did something crucial to Chuikov's strategy. They made the cost of movement, at every scale, prohibitively high for the attacking force. Germans could not move tanks without losing them in the rubble. They could not move infantry across open squares without losing them to machine guns and marksmen. And now they could not move at all, even cautiously, wondering whether a single shot from an unseen window was about to end it. The city had become a machine for converting German mobility, the single greatest advantage the Wehrmacht possessed anywhere else in the war, into a liability. While all of this played out block by block inside the city, a second, entirely separate piece of the hidden strategy was taking shape far away from the fighting, one that depended, ironically, on the German high command believing the battle for the city was still the only thing that mattered. The weak links in the Axis line. For all the attention Stalingrad's street fighting has received in the decades since, the battle's actual outcome was decided at
much by geography and alliance politics as by anything happening inside the city itself. Feeding an army into a meat grinder like Stalingrad required protecting its flanks over enormous distances of open steppe to the north and south of the city, along the Don River and the sparse country beyond it. The German High Command did not have enough German troops to hold all of that ground itself, not while also fighting street to street inside the city and pushing simultaneously toward the Caucasus oil fields hundreds of kilometers to the south. So those flanks were handed to Germany's allies. The Romanian Third Army held a long stretch of front north and northwest of Stalingrad. The Romanian Fourth Army held ground to the south, and further along the line, Hungarian and Italian armies covered additional sections of the Don front. These were not weak soldiers in the sense of lacking courage. Many fought and died bravely in the battles that followed, but they were, in almost every material sense, badly outmatched for the job they had been given. Compared to German formations, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units at the front were shorter on modern anti-tank weapons, shorter on their own armor, and stretched across frontages far longer than their troop numbers could realistically defend in depth. Where a German division might hold several kilometers of front with reserves close behind, some Axis Allied divisions were spread across 10 times that distance, with almost nothing in reserve at all. German commanders were not blind to this risk.
Requests from Romanian and Hungarian generals for more armor, more anti-tank guns, and more direct German support along their sectors reached the High Command repeatedly in the months before November 1942. Some of those requests were partially met. Many were delayed, deprioritized, or denied outright, because by the autumn of 1942, Hitler's attention, and with it the bulk of German reinforcements and armor reserves, was consumed by the fight for the city itself. Sixth Army's slow, grinding advance through the rubble had become the thing Berlin cared about above almost everything else on the entire Eastern Front. The flanks, held by allies whose equipment and reinforcement needs kept losing out to the demands of the city fighting, were treated as a secondary problem to be managed, rather than a vulnerability to be urgently fixed. Soviet planners watching from the other side of the map saw exactly what German High Command had allowed to happen. While Chuikov's soldiers bled for every building inside the city, two other Red Army commanders, men whose names would end up mattering as much to the battle's outcome as Chuikov's own, were studying those same overstretched, under-armored flank positions and building a plan that depended entirely on the Germans not noticing what was coming until it was already too late. Hidden Strategy 4, Maskirovka, the art of lying to an army. In August 1942, as the fight for the city was just beginning to spiral into the brutal, grinding contest Chuikov would soon be commanding, Stalin appointed General Georgy Zhukov as Deputy Supreme Commander with a mandate to fix the crumbling southern front. Zhukov, already one of the most capable commanders in the Red Army after organizing the defense of Leningrad and helping drive the Germans back from the gates of Moscow the previous winter, worked alongside Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky on a plan that went far beyond simply reinforcing Chuikov's collapsing perimeter. Their thinking rested on a cold, almost mathematical premise. Stalingrad itself did not have to be won by holding every building forever. It had to be held long enough. Every day the German 6th Army spent grinding through another block of rebel was a day it wasn't somewhere else, a day its best infantry and armor divisions were being consumed in a fight that produced no strategic gain even when it produced tactical progress. Zhukov's plan was to let that grinding continue, at horrific cost to the men doing the actual fighting, while assembling far from the city and largely out of German view. The force needed to end the battle a completely different way, not by pushing the Germans back out of Stalingrad, but by encircling and destroying the army that was trying to take it. Making that plan work depended on the Germans not discovering it in time to react. This is where the Red Army leaned on a discipline the Soviets called Maskirovka,
a term that covers far more than the English word camouflage usually suggests. Maskirovka meant an integrated program of secrecy, deception, and disinformation, practiced at every level from an individual soldier hiding his silhouette to entire armies disguising their location, size, and intentions from an enemy's reconnaissance and intelligence services. In the months before the counterattack, Soviet forces built entire dummy troop concentrations using painted wooden and canvas mock-ups of tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, positioned to draw German reconnaissance attention toward false buildups, while the real divisions moved elsewhere under strict noise and light discipline. Radio operators broadcast fabricated traffic designed to suggest units were still in locations they had already left or preparing operations that had no basis in reality, while the actual formations preparing for the real attack maintained radio silence and moved only at night. Troop movements were staged to occur under cover of darkness whenever possible, with units halting well before dawn to camouflage themselves before German reconnaissance aircraft could make their morning passes. The results were remarkable. German intelligence services, including the Foreign Armies East Department responsible for assessing Soviet strength on the Eastern Front, significantly underestimated both the size and the location of the forces the Red Army was massing. As late as the first days of November 1942, senior German officers were advising that Soviet reserves were nearly exhausted and incapable of mounting a major offensive anywhere near Stalingrad. Hitler's own instincts reinforced this misjudgment. He had convinced himself that the Red Army lacked the manpower and armor reserves for a serious counterstroke, and that conviction made him and his staff less inclined to question intelligence that told them what they already wanted to believe. It is one of the stranger ironies of the battle that some of the deception working against the German High Command in the autumn of 1942 wasn't only Soviet in origin. Hitler was, in a very real sense, helping deceive himself. Behind that screen of secrecy, Zhukov and Vasilevsky assembled an enormous force. 3 entire Red Army fronts, the Southwestern Front, the Don Front, and the Stalingrad Front, comprising more than 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a substantial fraction of the artillery and aircraft the Soviet Union could bring to bear anywhere on the Eastern Front that autumn. All of it was positioned north and south of the city, aimed squarely at the long, thin, poorly defended stretches of front held by the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, the exact weak points German High Command had spent months treating as a secondary concern.
By the second week of November 1942, the pieces were in place. The city was still burning. Chuikov's soldiers were still fighting, room by room, for ground measured in meters, and 400 kilometers of quiet, apparently unremarkable steppe to the north and south of Stalingrad concealed one of the largest coordinated deceptions of the entire war, a trap built not from a single secret weapon or a single brilliant maneuver, but from months of patient, disciplined lying on a scale large enough to fool an entire army group. The name given to the operation that would spring that trap was Uranus. Operation Uranus, the trap springs. At 07:20 Moscow time on 19 November 1942, a Soviet artillery bombardment tore into the positions of the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. It went on for well over an hour, an overwhelming concentration of firepower directed at a front line that had never been built to withstand anything like it. Romanian defenders who survived the barrage emerged from their positions dazed, many units shattered before Soviet infantry and armor had even begun their advance. This was the opening blow of Operation Uranus. The counteroffensive Zhukov and Vasylevsky had spent months preparing in secret. The Southwestern Front, under General Nicolae Vatutin, drove directly through the Romanian Third Army's shattered line and pushed deep into what had, until that morning, been the German rear. A day later, on 20 November, a second Soviet assault opened to the south of the city, striking the Romanian Fourth Army and driving north to meet the first prong of the attack in a classic double envelopment maneuver, precisely the kind of large-scale encirclement operation the Red Army had spent the whole war building toward and had rarely, until this point, been able to execute successfully against the Wehrmacht. The speed of the Romanian collapse stunned everyone,
including some of the Soviet commanders who had planned for it. Within a day of the initial attack, the Third Romanian Army was in headlong retreat, its formations bypassed rather than destroyed piecemeal as Soviet mechanized spearheads drove past them toward the rendezvous point deep in what had been secure German territory only 72 hours earlier. German mobile reserves in the area, including armored units that might, in theory, have blunted the attack, proved too thin and too slow to organize an effective counterstroke in time. Meanwhile, the Sixth Army, still locked into the grinding building-by-building fight inside the city that Chuikov's strategy had made so costly to sustain, could not disengage its own armor and redirect it to meet the new threat quickly enough to matter. The very success of hugging the enemy inside Stalingrad, the fact that German forces were pinned down fighting for individual city blocks, helped ensure that Sixth Army had no fast, mobile reserve of its own left free to respond to a disaster unfolding 100 kilometers away. By 23 November 1942, the northern and southern Soviet pincers linked up near the small town of Kalach on the Don River, closing the ring. Roughly 290,000 Axis personnel, the bulk of the German Sixth Army, elements of the 4th Panzer Army, and remaining Romanian units caught inside the pocket, were suddenly cut off, encircled deep inside what had 4 days earlier been entirely secure territory. It is worth pausing on how completely this reversed the battle's entire logic. For 2 months, the story of Stalingrad had been about a German army slowly, grindingly conquering a city meter by meter, absorbing horrific losses for equally horrific gains. In the space of 4 days, that story became something else entirely. The same army that had been advancing was now trapped, its supply lines severed, its ability to maneuver gone, surrounded by a Soviet force it had, until days before, believed no longer existed in any strength worth worrying about. That reversal was the entire point of the hidden strategy. Chuikov's soldiers had not been fighting simply to hold a city. They had been fighting, at staggering cost, to keep the German Sixth Army fixed in place, pinned down, distracted, consuming its own strength, for exactly as long as Zhukov and Vasylevsky needed to finish building the trap around it. The two halves of the strategy, the desperate close-quarters defense inside the city and the patient, secretive buildup on the flanks outside it, were not separate stories. They were one plan executed in 2 places at once, and neither half could have worked without the other. Now, the only question left was whether Berlin would recognize what had happened in time to do anything about it. The Cauldron, Manstein's failed rescue. Hitler's response to the encirclement was immediate and, in hindsight, catastrophic. Rather than authorize Sixth Army to attempt a breakout while it still had fuel and cohesion enough to try, he ordered Pallas to hold in place, declared the pocket a fortress to be defended at all costs, and accepted a promise from Hermann Göring that the Luftwaffe could keep the trapped army supplied entirely by air. That promise was never realistic. Sixth Army needed several hundred tons of fuel, ammunition, and food delivered every single day simply to keep functioning, let alone to fight its way out. The Luftwaffe, hampered by worsening winter weather, a shrinking number of usable airfields inside the pocket, and increasingly effective Soviet fighter patrols and anti-aircraft fire, never came close to delivering that volume on any sustained basis. The gap between what Sixth Army needed and what actually arrived by air widened every week, and every week the men trapped inside the pocket grew hungrier, colder, and weaker.
To rescue the encircled army, Hitler formed a new headquarters, Army Group Dawn, and placed one of Germany's most capable commanders, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, in charge of organizing a relief effort. In mid-December 1942, Manstein launched Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm, sending General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army driving northeast toward the pocket in a bid to punch a corridor through to the trapped 6th Army before it was too late. For a tense week, it looked as though the operation might succeed. Hoth's spearhead fought its way to within roughly 50 kilometers of the pocket's edge by late December, close enough that on clear nights flares from the fighting
could reportedly be seen from inside the encirclement. But closing that final gap required something Paulus was never authorized, and by then barely equipped, to provide: a coordinated breakout attempt from inside the pocket to meet Hoth's forces halfway. Hitler had explicitly forbidden any withdrawal from Stalingrad, and 6th Army, its vehicles starved of fuel for weeks, may not have had the mobility left to mount a serious breakout, even if the order had come. Paulus, a cautious, order-following officer to the end, did not act with Hitler's explicit authorization, and that authorization never arrived. At almost the same moment, a separate Soviet offensive struck further west, tearing into the Italian 8th Army's positions along the Don, and threatening to cut off Manstein's own relief force from behind. Forced to divert troops to stabilize that new crisis, Manstein's rescue attempt lost its momentum, and by the final days of December 1942, collapsed entirely. The corridor to the trapped 6th Army was never opened. From that point on, everyone still inside the pocket, whatever Berlin's propaganda continued to claim, was fighting a battle that could no longer be won, only prolonged. What followed through January 1943 was less a military campaign than a slow, grinding catastrophe. Frostbite, starvation, typhus, and untreated wounds killed at a rate that in places matched or exceeded combat losses. Ammunition ran low. Horses were slaughtered for food. Soldiers who had marched 1,000 miles into Soviet territory the previous summer, confident in the invincibility of their army, were now dying by the thousands in cellars and dugouts, waiting for a rescue that had already failed weeks before most of them understood it had ever been attempted. Operation Ring and the surrender. With the relief effort broken and no prospect of rescue remaining, the Red Army moved to finish what Operation Uranus had begun. On 10 January 1943, the Don Front, commanded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky, launched Operation Koltso, Operation Ring, a systematic offensive designed to compress and ultimately annihilate the trapped 6th Army rather than simply contain it. The pocket, already starving and out of fuel, began to collapse under the renewed pressure almost immediately. Soviet forces captured the airfield at Potomnik, then the airfield at Gumrak, severing even the meager trickle of supplies the Luftwaffe had still been managing to fly in. Without airfields, without fuel, and increasingly without ammunition, organized resistance inside the pocket began to fracture into isolated pockets of its own, each one fighting on with less coordination and less hope than the one before. On 30 January 1943, in a decision loaded with unmistakable symbolism, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. No German field marshal in the nation's history had ever surrendered to an enemy, and the implication of the promotion was as clear as it was chilling. Hitler expected Paulus either to fight to the last man or to take his own life rather than become the first. Paulus did neither. On 31 January 1943, he surrendered his own headquarters and the southern half of the pocket to Soviet forces. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the remaining German troops in the northern pocket under General Karl Strecker surrendered as well, bringing organized resistance at Stalingrad to an end after roughly 5.5 months of continuous fighting. Around 91,000 German and Allied soldiers went into Soviet captivity in the battle's final days, exhausted, frostbitten, and in many cases barely able to walk. Conditions in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps in the months and years that followed were brutal, and the overwhelming majority of those men never saw Germany again. Only a small fraction survived captivity long enough to be repatriated, some not until the 1950s, more than a decade after the battle ended. The full scale of the human cost across the entire campaign, from the German summer offensive through the final surrender, is almost impossible to convey in ordinary terms. Total Axis casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured, are generally estimated in the hundreds of thousands, alongside comparably enormous, and by some estimates even larger, Soviet losses. Exact figures vary between historians, and probably always will, given the chaos of the fighting and the incomplete records on both sides. What is not disputed is that Stalingrad remains, by casualties alone, among the costliest single battles in the history of warfare, a fact made almost stranger by how much of that cost was driven not by a single climactic clash, but by months of exactly the kind of grinding, room-by-room, building-by-building combat that Chuikov's hidden strategy had deliberately set out to create. The Volga Lifeline. There is one more piece of the hidden strategy that rarely makes it into shorter retellings of the battle, and it has nothing to do with storm groups, snipers, or deception operations on the flanks. It has to do with a river. Throughout the battle, the 62nd Army held only a thin, irregular strip of the city's western riverbank, with the Volga at its back. Stalin's order forbidding retreat was not simply a threat aimed at wavering soldiers. For the men actually holding that strip of riverbank, it was close to a literal description of their situation. There was nowhere left to go. Behind the last line of Soviet defenders was open water, and beyond that, the relatively safer eastern bank, from which every reinforcement, every crate of ammunition, every stretcher of wounded men, and every hot meal that reached the fighting had to cross. That crossing happened almost entirely at night, by small boats, barges, and makeshift ferries, under near constant threat from German artillery observers and aircraft who understood exactly how vital the river traffic was and worked hard to interdict it. Crossing points were shelled routinely, boats were sunk with soldiers still aboard. And yet, remarkably, the Soviet High Command never allowed that lifeline to be fully severed for the length of the battle, an achievement of logistics and raw courage that gets far less attention than the fighting it made possible, but without which none of Chuikov's tactics could have been sustained for more than a few days. Every storm group, every sniper position, every fortified building like the one Pavlov's platoon held, depended on a steady, bloody trickle as men and supplies crossing open water under fire, night after night, for nearly 6 months. One episode captures just how precarious that lifeline could become. For an extended stretch of the battle, a Soviet rifle division under Colonel Ivan Lyudnikov found itself cut off from the rest of the 62nd Army's main position, pressed into a small perimeter on the riverbank near the Barakades arms factory, its connection to the rest of the army reduced to whatever could be smuggled across the water at night under fire. Soviet accounts and later histories refer to this position simply as Lyudnikov's Island, an apt name for a strip of riverbank that functioned for weeks as an actual island, isolated, surrounded, resupplied only by the most hazardous means available, and holding on regardless. It was not until the very end of December 1942, as Operation Uranus's encirclement was already tightening around the German 6th Army from the outside, that the defenders of Lyudnikov's Island were finally reconnected to the rest of the 62nd Army's main bridgehead. It's worth sitting with that detail for a moment because it reframes the whole battle. The version of Stalingrad most people know is a story about buildings, Pavlov's house, the grain silo, the factories. But underneath that story is a second one, just as essential and far less visible, a nightly, unglamorous, unbelievably dangerous ferry operation across an exposed river run for almost half a year that kept the entire defense alive. Chuikov could invent all the close-quarters tactics he wanted. None of it mattered without men and ammunition crossing that water in the dark, over and over, for as long as it took. The architects, Zhukov and Vasilevsky. If Chuikov is the name most associated with the defense of Stalingrad, the two men most responsible for the offensive that actually ended the battle deserve just as much attention, even though, by design, almost nobody on the German side knew their plan existed until it was already underway. Zhukov had already built a formidable reputation by the autumn of 1942. He had led the counterattack that encircled and crushed a Japanese army at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, helped organize the desperate defense of Leningrad after the German invasion began, and played a central role in the Soviet counteroffensive that pushed German forces back from the outskirts of Moscow in the winter of 1941 into 1942. When Stalin made him deputy supreme commander in August 1942 and sent him south, Zhukov brought with him a hard-earned instinct: trade space and time for the ability to strike back with overwhelming force at a moment and place of his own choosing, rather
than feed reserves piecemeal into a battle the enemy was already winning. Alexander Vasilevsky, as chief of the general staff, was Zhukov's essential partner in turning that instinct into an executable plan. Vasilevsky's role was less public than Zhukov's, but no less critical, coordinating the movement, supply, and concealment of the three entire fronts being assembled for the counterattack, synchronizing the timing of the northern and southern pincers so they would strike within a day of each other and meet cleanly at Kalach, and managing the staggering logistical challenge of moving over 1 million men, along with their tanks, artillery, and supplies, into position without tipping off German reconnaissance. Together, Zhukov and Vasilevsky made a wager that ran directly counter to the instincts that had governed much of the Red Army's conduct of the war up to that point. Soviet doctrine and Soviet political culture in 1942 rewarded immediate, visible action, counterattacking, holding ground, showing Moscow that a front was fighting rather than merely absorbing punishment. Zhukov and Vasilevsky instead argued for patience on an enormous scale. Let Chuikov's soldiers bleed for the city, accept the political and human cost of appearing to lose slowly for months, and hold back the forces that could actually end the battle until the moment of maximum effect. It was, in its own way, exactly the same logic Chuikov had discovered inside the city, accept a brutal, unglamorous cost now in exchange for making the enemy's core strength irrelevant later, scaled up from a single ruined building to an entire theater of war. Stalin approved the plan in the face of understandable pressure to do something faster and more visible. That approval, as much as anything that happened on the battlefield itself, was the moment the hidden strategy of Stalingrad became possible at all. The enemy's blind spot. No deception operation succeeds purely on its own merits. It succeeds because it is aimed at a target already primed in some way to believe it. Understanding why the Maskurovka campaign around Stalingrad worked as completely as it did means looking honestly at the command culture on the other side of the line, because German High Command's blind spot was not simply bad luck, it was, in important ways, self-inflicted. Adolf Hitler had, by late 1942, developed a deep and increasingly rigid conviction that retreat under pressure was itself a form of weakness bordering on betrayal. This was not a belief invented for Stalingrad specifically. It would recur throughout the rest of the war in decision after decision where tactical withdrawal might have preserved forces that instead were destroyed holding ground Hitler had declared non-negotiable. At Stalingrad, that conviction expressed itself as an outright refusal to consider withdrawing Sixth Army from the city, even as the risk of encirclement became apparent to some of his own generals, and then as an insistence that the trapped army hold its position and wait for aerial resupply rather than attempt to break out while it still had the strength to try. Friedrich Paulus, for his part, was almost perfectly suited to a trap built around the assumption that the trapped commander would not act independently. He was a careful, procedurally minded staff officer, promoted in large part because of his talent for methodical planning rather than any history of bold, improvisational battlefield decision-making. Faced with explicit orders from Hitler forbidding retreat and lacking the kind of independent temperament that might have led another commander to act first and justify it later, Paulus held his position and waited for authorization that never came. Whether an earlier breakout attempt in coordination with Manstein's relief drive could actually have succeeded remains genuinely disputed among historians. Sixth Army's fuel shortages alone made any large-scale mobile operation deeply uncertain by December 1942. But the fact that Paulus never seriously attempted it, even as the odds against rescue by any other means grew clearer by the week, reflects exactly the kind of command rigidity Soviet planners were counting on. That rigidity extended into the intelligence apparatus feeding Hitler information. Assessments from foreign armies east, the department responsible for judging Soviet capabilities, told Hitler in the weeks before Uranus that the Red Army lacked the reserves for a major counteroffensive, an assessment that fit comfortably with what Hitler already wanted to hear, and one that appears to have gone largely unchallenged rather than aggressively tested against contrary evidence. In a command culture where questioning the Führer's strategic assumptions carried
professional and personal risk, intelligence that confirmed those assumptions had an obvious advantage over intelligence that contradicted them, regardless of which was actually closer to the truth. None of this is meant to suggest German commanders were unintelligent, or the ordinary soldiers fighting under them were somehow lesser than their Soviet counterparts. The fighting inside the city and the endurance shown by trapped Sixth Army troops through the winter that followed argue strongly against any such conclusion. What it does suggest is a genuinely important and often underappreciated layer of the hidden strategy. Zhukov and Vasilevsky were not simply hiding tanks and broadcasting fake radio traffic into a void. They were exploiting a specific, identifiable weakness in how the opposing high command processed information and made decisions. A rigidity that made the German side more likely to believe reassuring intelligence, less likely to act on ambiguous warning signs, and less able to respond flexibly once the trap had already closed. The deception worked because it was aimed at exactly the right target, in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment. The turning of the war. The surrender at Stalingrad sent shockwaves through Germany that Nazi propaganda could not fully contain. For the first time in the war, the German public was confronted unmistakably with the reality of a catastrophic defeat rather than a temporary setback on the road to eventual victory. Public mourning was officially declared. The tone of state radio broadcasts shifted, however briefly, from triumphant to somber. It was the first moment in the war when ordinary Germans, not just military planners, had to reckon with the possibility that the war itself might not end the way they had been told to expect. For the Allied powers and for occupied Europe, the news traveled in the opposite emotional direction. An army that had seemed unstoppable for 3 straight years had not merely been checked, it had been encircled, starved, and forced into the largest mass surrender in German military history to that point.
The psychological effect on Soviet morale and on the morale of resistance movements and Allied publics elsewhere was immense, arriving at a moment when positive news from any front had been desperately scarce. Strategically, the defeat marked something close to a permanent shift in the war's balance on the Eastern Front. Germany would still launch major offensives afterward, Kursk the following summer being the largest tank battle in history, but Stalingrad was the point after which the overall strategic initiative in the East never fully returned to German hands. The Wehrmacht spent the rest of the war reacting to Soviet offensives far more often than launching its own, a reversal whose roots trace directly back to the forces and the confidence the Sixth Army's destruction cost Germany. Historians continue to debate exactly how much weight to place on Stalingrad specifically versus other pivotal moments of the war. The Battle of Midway in the Pacific, the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa, and the following year's Battle of Kursk are all argued by different historians to deserve equal or greater credit as the war's actual turning point. That debate is legitimate and unlikely to ever fully resolve, since turning point is as much a matter of interpretation as of measurable fact. What is far less disputed is the scale of what happened at Stalingrad itself, and the fact that an entire German field army, one of the most experienced formations the Wehrmacht possessed, ceased to exist there, destroyed not primarily by superior weapons, but by a strategy built from patience, deception, and a willingness to fight in a manner no pre-war doctrine on either side had anticipated. Legacy: why this hidden strategy still matters. Military academies did not stop studying Stalingrad once the guns fell silent in February 1943. If anything, the battle's influence on how militaries think about urban combat only grew over the following decades, precisely because so much of what happened there had never been systematically studied before. Consider how often the same basic problem has reappeared since. When American and other Allied forces fought through the German city of Aachen in the autumn of 1944, they encountered many of the same dynamics Chuikov soldiers had faced 2 years earlier: armor rendered nearly useless by rubble and narrow streets, the need for small, combined infantry engineer teams to clear buildings floor by floor, and close-quarters fighting where air power and artillery
had to be used with extreme caution to avoid hitting friendly troops. By 1945, ironically, it was German forces defending Berlin itself who found themselves relying on some of the same improvised close-quarters tactics Soviet defenders had pioneered at Stalingrad 3 years before, only this time against a Red Army that had learned those lessons intimately and brought them home. The pattern kept recurring long after the Second World War ended. American forces fighting through the city of Hue during the 1968 Tet Offensive in Vietnam faced house-to-house combat that veterans and historians alike have compared directly to Stalingrad's factory districts. Russian forces attacking Grozny during the First Chechen War in the mid-1990s initially ignored these lessons almost entirely, sending armored columns into the city's streets with minimal infantry support, and paid for that mistake with catastrophic tank losses eerily similar to the Wehrmacht's experience decades earlier, a mistake Russian forces adapted away from only after suffering heavily for it. American and coalition forces clearing Fallujah in Iraq in 2004 drew on urban warfare doctrine that by then explicitly traced its intellectual lineage back through generations of military study to the storm group tactics born in Stalingrad's ruins. None of this means the tactics themselves are timeless or simply transferable across every era and every technology. Modern militaries fight with drones, thermal imaging, and precision munitions that did not exist in 1942, and any doctrine that ignores those tools in favor of nostalgia for close-quarters combat would be making a serious mistake. What has proven durable is not the specific weapons or even the specific tactics, but the underlying principle Chuikov discovered almost by necessity. An enemy's advantages are not fixed facts of the battlefield. They are conditions that exist only as long as the terrain, the range, and the tempo of the fight allow them to matter. Change those conditions, close the distance, break up the terrain, disrupt the tempo, and even the most technologically superior force can find its strengths turned into liabilities. The Maskirovka side of the strategy left an equally durable legacy. Deception, concealment, and disinformation remained central pillars of Soviet and later Russian military doctrine for the rest of the 20th century, studied and refined as a formal discipline rather than treated as an occasional battlefield trick. Western militaries, for their part, spent decades of the Cold War specifically trying to understand and counter Maskirovka techniques, recognizing that an army capable of hiding 1 million soldiers in plain sight from an entire enemy intelligence apparatus represented a genuine and repeatable strategic threat, not a one-time fluke made possible only by 1942's technology. Perhaps the broadest lesson, though, is the simplest one, and it is worth stating plainly rather than dressing it up.
Overwhelming strength in one dimension of warfare, air power, armor, firepower, technology, does not guarantee victory against an opponent willing to change the terms of the fight entirely. Stalingrad's hidden strategy did not defeat the Wehrmacht by matching German strength with equal or greater strength. It defeated the Wehrmacht by making German strength irrelevant in one place for long enough, while quietly building an entirely different kind of strength somewhere the German high command had stopped looking. That is a lesson military planners still take seriously today, in contexts having nothing to do with Russia, Germany, or the 1940s, because the underlying insight was never really about that one war. It was about how any dominant force can be beaten, if its opponent is patient enough, disciplined enough, and willing to pay a terrible price to make that dominance stop meaning anything. The price of no retreat. No honest account of this hidden strategy can leave out its darkest supporting mechanism, because hugging the enemy and the patient build-up toward Uranus were not sustained by tactical brilliance alone. They were also sustained by coercion, and pretending otherwise would flatten a genuinely difficult piece of history into something cleaner and more comfortable than it actually was. In July 1942, weeks before Chuikov even took command, Stalin issued Order No. 227 in response to a summer of collapsing fronts across southern Russia. The order became known informally by its central demand: not one step back. Its mechanisms were blunt and coercive by design. Commanders who withdrew without explicit authorization faced tribunal, demotion, or worse. New penal battalions and penal companies were created, made up largely of officers and soldiers deemed guilty of cowardice or unauthorized retreat, assigned to the
war's most dangerous tasks as a kind of forced redemption. Perhaps most consequential on the ground at Stalingrad itself, the order authorized so-called blocking detachments, armed units, often under NKVD control, stationed behind the main front line with explicit orders to stop retreating soldiers, using force if necessary. This was not a theoretical threat. Soviet internal reports from inside the battle describe blocking detachments actively detaining large numbers of soldiers found retreating or separated from their units. In one documented report from the NKVD chief of the Stalingrad front, covering just a 3-day period in mid-September 1942, over 1,200 men were detained by a single army's blocking detachment. Some of those detained were reassigned to their units. Others faced far harsher consequences. The precise scale of executions carried out under this system at Stalingrad specifically is difficult to establish with confidence and remains debated among historians, but the broader system of coercive discipline behind the not one step back order is not in dispute. It is important to hold both truths about Stalingrad's defense at once, without letting either one erase the other. Chuikov's tactical innovations were real, and the soldiers who executed them showed extraordinary endurance under conditions almost impossible to fully convey. At the same time, that endurance was not purely voluntary in the way inspirational retelling sometimes imply. It existed inside a system that made retreat, for many soldiers, at least as dangerous as staying and fighting, sometimes more so. The hidden strategy that broke the German Sixth Army was built by human beings acting with genuine courage and tactical ingenuity inside a command structure that was also, simultaneously, willing to compel that courage through fear. Neither fact cancels the other out. Both belong in the story. The factories that never stopped. Before the war reached its streets, Stalingrad was one of the Soviet Union's genuinely important industrial cities, and that industrial identity did not simply vanish once the fighting arrived. It became part of the battle itself, in a way that still startles people encountering it for the first time. The city's tractor factory had been converted, like many Soviet industrial plants, to wartime production early in the conflict, turning out T-34 tanks, the same tank that would go on to become one of the most significant armored vehicles of the entire war. The Barricadi plant produced artillery pieces and ammunition. The Red October Works supplied steel. All three sat in the northern industrial districts of the city, and all three became some of the most fiercely contested ground of the entire battle, fought over literally floor by floor and furnace by furnace. What makes this piece of the story remarkable is that production reportedly did not simply stop when the fighting arrived at the factory gates. Workers continued repairing damaged tanks, and in some documented cases, completing partially assembled vehicles even as combat raged nearby, occasionally close enough that newly finished tanks are said to have driven essentially straight from the assembly line into combat a short distance away, in the most literal possible sense of a wartime economy fighting for its own survival. The line between industrial worker and combatant, like so many other lines inside Stalingrad, simply dissolved under the pressure of the siege. It is worth pairing this detail with the story of Chuikov's tactics, because it captures something the tactical narrative alone can miss. Stalingrad was never only a military problem being solved by soldiers. It was an entire city, its workers, its factories, its civilians sheltering in basements, absorbed into a single continuous fight for survival, where the distinction between the front and everywhere else had effectively ceased to mean anything at all. Stalingrad remembered today. The city itself no longer carries the name it did in 1942.
In 1961, as part of a broader Soviet effort to distance the state from Stalin's legacy, it was renamed Volgograd, and that is the name it carries today. The physical memory of the battle, though, was built on an enormous scale. Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that changed hands so many times during the fighting that its elevation was said to have been permanently altered by shelling, is now home to one of the largest war memorial complexes in the world, anchored by the statue known as the Motherland Calls, a sword-wielding figure that stood, at the time of its completion in 1967, among the tallest statues on the planet. The hill also
contains mass graves from the battle and maintains a continuously burning eternal flame in memory of the dead. Elements of the built environment from the battle itself survive as deliberate memorials. A section of Pavlov's house still stands in modern Volgograd, incorporated into memorial architecture that marks its role in the fighting. The city's Battle of Stalingrad Panorama Museum houses artifacts from the fighting alongside a vast panoramic painting depicting the battle at its height, one of the largest works of its kind anywhere in the world. Every year, the anniversary of the battle's end is marked with commemorations in the city and across Russia, and Stalingrad continues to occupy an outsized place in Russian national memory, a status that, like the battle's place in broader turning point of the war debates among historians, reflects an ongoing act of interpretation as much as a settled historical fact. What is not in question is the scale of what is being remembered, a battle that, more than 80 years later, remains one of the largest and costliest single engagements in the history of organized warfare. Life and death in the ruins. Strip away the tactics and the operational maps for a moment, and Stalingrad was also, simply, an unimaginably hard place to be alive. By November and December 1942, temperatures on the steppe regularly dropped far below freezing, and for the encircled German Sixth Army in particular, cold became as lethal an enemy as anything the Red Army did on purpose. Frostbite crippled soldiers who had never trained or equipped for a Russian winter, fought from inside a collapsing pocket rather than from a warm rear area billet. Disease spread easily in conditions where clean water, sanitation, and medical care had all broken down. Typhus and dysentery moved through both armies, and lice were so universal on the German side by the battle's final weeks that soldiers' own letters and later memoirs described them almost as a background condition of existence, no longer worth remarking on individually. Hunger reshaped daily life on both sides of the line, though far more severely inside the shrinking German pocket after November, where supply had collapsed almost entirely. Rations fell by the week. Horses were killed for food once other supplies ran out. Soldiers who had begun the campaign confident in the invincibility of German logistics ended it foraging through ruins for anything edible, weeks or months before the final surrender. Perhaps the strangest, most disorienting feature of life inside the battle was time itself. Storm group tactics and the citywide close-quarters fighting meant combat did not pause neatly at nightfall the way it might on a more conventional front. Fighting, movement, and killing continued through the night as often as the day, sometimes more so, since darkness offered cover for exactly the kind of close infiltration Chuikov's doctrine depended on. Veterans of the battle on both sides described in later accounts a loss of any normal sense of day and date, weeks blurring into an undifferentiated stretch of noise, rebel, and fear, with the passage of time marked less by calendars than by which building or floor was currently being fought over. None of this softens the tactical story told earlier in this script. If anything, it sharpens it. Every hidden strategy described here, the hugging tactic, the storm groups, the deception on the flanks, was executed by human beings enduring exactly these conditions for months without any guarantee that the plan unfolding above their heads would ever actually work. The world watches. While the battle unfolded, it was not fought in isolation from the rest of the war, and it did not go unnoticed outside the Soviet Union and Germany. By the autumn and winter of 1942, the wider war was still very much undecided. Fighting in North Africa had only just turned decisively in the Allies' favor with the Second Battle of El Alamein and the Allied landings of Operation Torch, and the Pacific War remained a grinding, uncertain campaign. Against that backdrop, Western newspapers and radio broadcasts followed the fighting at Stalingrad closely as it developed, treating it as one of the war's genuinely pivotal contests even before its outcome was clear. Allied political leaders publicly acknowledged the significance of the Soviet defense while it was still underway, recognizing correctly, as it turned out, that the fate of an entire German field army hung on its outcome. For Allied publics starved of unambiguous good news from any front, the eventual Soviet victory offered exactly that, arriving at a moment when it was badly needed. It also served, deliberately, as a piece of shared Allied narrative, proof that Axis forces could be defeated outright, not merely held or delayed.
and evidence used to bolster public support for the broader alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers at a stage of the war when that alliance still required active political maintenance on all sides. The battle's reach, in other words, extended well past the rubble of the city itself. It was being watched, discussed, and drawn into political and propaganda narratives across multiple continents, even while the storm groups were still fighting for individual buildings. A reminder that the hidden strategy unfolding on the ground was, from the very start, part of a war being fought as much in newsrooms and radio broadcasts as in ruined apartment blocks. The buildings that became battlefields. Pavlov's house is the most famous single structure from the battle, but it was far from the only building whose defense became, in effect, its own miniature campaign. And two others deserve mention, because together they bookend the entire story of the hidden strategy described in this script. Early in the fighting, in September 1942, a massive reinforced concrete grain elevator on the city's southern edge became the site of one of the battle's most disproportionate contests. A relatively small, mixed garrison of Soviet defenders, including naval infantry alongside army troops, held the structure for roughly 3 weeks against repeated German assaults, using the elevator's thick concrete walls and internal grain storage chambers as a fortress that conventional infantry assault struggled to crack. German accounts from the time describe genuine surprise at how much resistance a single industrial structure could produce, exactly the kind of disproportionate defensive value Chuikov's broader doctrine depended on, playing out in miniature within the very first weeks of the city fighting, before hugging the enemy had even fully hardened into official policy. At the opposite end of the battle, chronologically, stands the Univermag department store in the city center. By January 1943, with the pocket collapsing under Operation Ring and 6th Army's position disintegrating by the day, the store's basement became Paulus's final field headquarters, the last command post of an army that 5 months earlier had expected to conquer this city in days. It was there, on January 31, 1943, that Paulus was taken into Soviet custody, newly promoted to field marshal, the first officer to hold that rank in German history to surrender to an enemy. There is a kind of grim symmetry in that detail worth sitting with. The war for Stalingrad began with a single overwhelming bombing raid intended to flatten the city in a day. It ended 5 months later in the basement of a department store, with the commander of one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced armies surrendering to soldiers whose entire strategy had been built on making buildings like this one, ordinary, unremarkable structures never designed to be fought over, into some of the most consequential terrain of the entire Second World War. Return for a moment to that German infantryman from the beginning of this story, pinned in the ruins of a tractor factory, listening to Russian voices through a shattered wall, waiting for a victory his commanders kept promising, and that never came. By the time the guns finally fell silent at Stalingrad in February 1943, tens of thousands of men very much like him were dead, and tens of thousands more were being marched east into a captivity that most of them would not survive. There is no way to tell this story honestly with sitting with that cost. The hidden strategy that broke the German 6th Army was not a clean, bloodless piece of clever thinking. It was built on Chuikov's soldiers absorbing catastrophic casualties, block by block, room by room, for months, so that a different battle could be won somewhere else entirely. It was built on Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian soldiers dying in positions that had been quietly written off as acceptable losses long before the attack that killed them ever began. It was built on civilians hiding in basements under buildings being fought over floor by floor, and on a river crossing that consumed lives every single night for the better part of half a year, largely unremarked in the histories that followed. And yet the strategy itself remains one
of the most genuinely remarkable pieces of military thinking to come out of the entire Second World War, not because it was elegant, but because of where it came from. It was not handed down from a war college or a general staff planning session in Moscow before the battle began. It was assembled, piece by piece, under fire, by commanders who understood that the rules everyone else was following no longer applied to the situation in front of them, and who had the discipline to build something new instead of simply losing according to the old rules. That, in the end, is the real untold story of Stalingrad. Not a secret battalion, not a hidden weapon, but a hidden idea. That strength is not a fixed property of tanks and aircraft and artillery, but a relationship between a force and the conditions it is fighting in, one that a sufficiently patient and sufficiently ruthless opponent can simply take apart, piece by piece, until it stops existing at all.